Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luis Fraga, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Charlene Villaseñor Black, Professor of Art History and Chicano Studies and Central American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is also Associate Director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, editor of the journal Aslan, a journal of Chicano studies, and founding editor-in-chief of Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture, LALVC, that is published by the University of California Press. She publishes on a range of topics related to Chicanx studies, contemporary Latinx art, and the early modern Iberian world. To date, she has won 6 awards for her editing work, including most recently 2 awards recognizing LALVCs as an outstanding new journal. Her most recent book with Dr. Maritere Alvarez of the Getty Museum is Renaissance Futurities, Art, Science, Invention, published in 2019. She also recently co-edited the new Chicano Studies Reader in 2020, the autobiography Without Apology, the personal essay in Latino Studies, also in 2020, and Knowledge for Justice, an ethnic studies reader in 2019, in addition to editing Shifra M. Goldman's final book, Tradition and Transformation, Chicano Art from the 1970s to the 1990s, which was published in 2015. Her monograph on colonial saints, tentatively entitled Transforming Saints, Women, Art, and Conversion in Spain and Mexico, 1521 to 1800, is forthcoming from Vanderbilt University Press in 2022, and her 2006 book, Creating the Cult of St. Joseph, Art and Gender in the Spanish Empire, won the College Art Association's Millard Mice Award. In 2016, she was awarded UCLA's Gold Shield Faculty Prize for Academic Excellence, bestowed annually on one faculty member in recognition of exceptional teaching, innovative research, and strong commitment to university service. She is a very busy and accomplished scholar. She's held grants from the Fulbright, Mellon, Borchard, and Woodrow Wilson Foundations, from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Getty. Currently, she is the principal investigator of Critical Mission Studies at California's Crossroads, a $1.03 million grant from the University of California's multi-campus research programs and initiatives. She will be at Oxford University next year as the Terra Foundation Visiting Professor of American Art. The title of her talk with us today is Thinking About Migration Through Latinx Art. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charlene Villaseñor Black.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I wanted to thank the University of Notre Dame and the Institute for Latino Studies for inviting me. I'm so grateful we can do this in webinar format, but sorry that I'm not there in person. I'd like to thank Director Luis Fraga and Associate Director Paloma Garcia Lopez, the staff people who helped me in the lead up to this event, and colleagues, faculty colleagues at the University of Notre Dame. And I'd also like to thank the artist, Sandy Rodriguez. I'll be talking about her today. Let's make visible our radical hospitality with the hashtag Migrant Caravan. This call, issued in October 2018 by Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano, called on Mexicans to help in the arrival of Central American refugees to Mexico City. It was a call that resonated with Jacques Derrida's 1996 dialogue on hospitality, which proposed unconditional hospitality, the complete and absolute acceptance of all immigrants all foreigners, in the face of growing xenophobia in France. Written 3 years after the 1993 revocation of birth citizenship under then Prime Minister Michel Rocard, Derrida's call is timely for us in the US. We're emerging from 4 years of Donald Trump, elected in November 2016 on waves of anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly directed at Latinos, Latinxes. You may recall the midterm elections of 2018, when Trump campaigned on behalf of fellow Republicans by sounding the alarm about the migrant caravan from Central America heading to the US, threatening to institute martial law. He followed up with the proclamation that he would end birthright citizenship guaranteed by the 14th Amendment through executive order. His proclamation, designed to rev up his base for the upcoming elections, distracted voters from the previous week's tragic events. The murder of 2 innocent African Americans in a Kentucky Kroger store by a white supremacist. 13 pipe bombs sent to prominent Democrats and newscasters, including 2 former presidents, by a Trump supporter. And the synagogue shooting that killed 11 in Pittsburgh. After 4 years, most of us sighed relief upon the election of Biden last November. In anticipation of more favorable laws and attitudes, migrants began gathering again at the border in hopes of successful crossing. We are called again to enact radical hospitality. And that ethical demand leads me to the questions I consider in my talk today. How have Chicanx and Latinx artists responded to the migration crises in recent years? What is the role of art and artists in this current context in the face of such human suffering? In this talk today, I think through these questions as I consider recent work by Los Angeles Chicana artist Sandy Rodriguez. Her installation, You Will Not Be Forgotten. I place her work in conversation with Derrida's Of Hospitality and other philosophical texts, considering the political potential of art in the current global migration crises and in politics more generally. In the end, I suggest that visual artists play an important and specific role in this context. Rodriguez's work has risen to visibility these past several years with important solo shows, publications, and recent acquisitions by major collections. Today, we will focus on her most current iteration of the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon, an ongoing series of installations. And I saw You Will Not Be Forgotten at the Charlie James Gallery in LA's Chinatown last year, February 28th, 2020, 18 days before California Governor Gavin Newsom issued the stay-at-home order, so almost exactly a year ago. You Will Not Be Forgotten is the second iteration of the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon. And I'm showing you here part of the first initial iteration dating to 2018. A recent 2019 article co-authored by Ella Diaz and Ananda Coanapante, both at Cornell in English language notes, interprets the Codex, an installation comprised of maps, botanical drawings, and sculptures, as explicitly focused on actions taken against immigrants in California. They describe the intensive research and fieldwork in which Rodriguez gathered botanical, earth, and mineral samples to create pigments, as well as the artist's study of surviving indigenous manuscripts. As they suggest in their analysis of the large-scale map on a mate paper that is central to the installation, and I'm showing that to you here on the left, de las señales y pronósticos and ice raids in el sanctuary state of Califas, Rodriguez visualizes the connections between recent deportations in California and the events of the 16th century conquest of the Americas. Today's deportations result from centuries of dehumanization of indigenous peoples. They also analyze the artist's deep engagement with the Florentine Codex, seen here on the right, also known as the General History of Things of New Spain, a lengthy manuscript in Nahuatl and Spanish, with more than 2,000 images. And this was compiled around 1577 by Francisco Friar Bernardino de Sahagún and his Central Mexican indigenous collaborators. They suggest the ways in which Rodriguez takes inspiration from the Florentine Codex as a repository of indigenous culture, history, and tradition. Today, I focus on her 2019 iteration of the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon entitled, You Will Not Be Forgotten. An installation comprised of 20 works created on amate paper with natural inks and watercolors. This installation was arranged in 2 rooms of the Charlie James Gallery. In the artist's own words, quote, You Will Not Be Forgotten is dedicated to the 7 Central American child migrants who died in US Customs and Border Protection during 2018 and 2019. The installation featured 7 portraits memorializing the deceased children. 2 depictions of indigenous Mesoamerican grandmother goddesses, the Maya Ixchel and the Nahuatl. Landscapes of the US-Mexico border that commemorate the children's final days and document the location of healing plants. 3 portraits of contemporaries as indigenous healers, including this beautiful self-portrait, and small botanical illustrations of plants able to heal the children's ailments, including susto or trauma, influenza, respiratory illnesses, and diseases of the heart, based on her careful study of the Florentine Codex and the Codex Cruz Badiano, both of which record indigenous Mesoamerican scientific knowledge. The works in You Will Not Be Forgotten were created after Rodriguez's field work in 2019 along the border, so in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, investigating medicinal plants and natural pigments and evading the Border Patrol herself. It was a process dedicated to decolonizing our past, offering hope for our present, and a more just future for the Americas. My interest today is in the 7 commemorative portraits of the children. They are unusual in her artistic production and unique in the history of Chicanx art. I begin by considering them as portraits, thinking about their creation. I then place them in the context of practices of memorialization, both contemporary and historical, secular and sacred. Then I consider the particular status of portraiture in Chicanx and Latinx art. How is Rodriguez's engagement with the past visible here? What haunting ghosts rise to visibility? To conclude, I turn to theoretical considerations of memory, hospitality, trauma, and hope. Why talk about art in the face of such heart-wrenching injustice? Rodriguez was spurred to action to create these pieces by grief and rage. When the deaths of these children became known through the media and activist orgs, she began working on portraits, each an amalgam created from photographs of the youngsters gathered from websites, complemented by research into each child's life, family, and circumstances. First, she did initial sketches in walnut ink on amate paper, each small in size, so they're about 4 to 6 inches, attempting to capture the essence of each child when alive. And I have 2 asides here. I want to add that she has been attempting to get in touch with the families in order to give them these portrait sketches that she created. And then I also want to let you know that I will not be describing the circumstances of the children's deaths, except in general terms when necessary to understand an artwork, out of respect for them and their family. If you're interested, you can look up the stories on the internet. So we're looking at the sketches here. Let's look at the final portraits, which are the central feature of the installation. Their process of creation and materiality are of interest to me here. I wish to emphasize their creation as process, as construction. In fact, I suggest that the development from sketches that attempt to capture something of the children in life to her finished, more formal portraits points to Rodriguez's interpretation of the children and the intent behind You Will Not Be Forgotten. So let's take a closer look. We'll begin by examining first the effects of the materials employed, then the artist's transformation from sketch to finished portrait. Both sketches and final works are rendered on amate paper, handmade in Mexico from the bark of mulberry or fig trees, a process dating back to ancient times. The paper comes in shades of browns and tans with swirling variations of tone. It is relatively thick with a palpable surface texture. Both sketches and final portraits were drawn in walnut ink, rich dark brown in color. 6 of the 7 final portraits have blue-green backgrounds, perhaps an allusion to the famous Maya blue pigment, a natural colorant created from indigo and clay, and one with significant symbolic meaning. The background reminds viewers that the children came from Central America, the Maya area. Rodriguez also includes national birds in the portraits, either a quetzal for Guatemala or a toragos for El Salvador. Finally, the blue-green color employed here was associated in Maya culture with death and with the priesthood. One could read its use as intended to sacralize the children, or perhaps even suggest they were sacrificial victims. We're now going to look at the portraits in order from left to right, along with their preparatory sketches. The first portrays Felipe, a quetzal bird on the lower left, identifying his place of birth as Guatemala. Rodriguez inscribed his name and birth and death dates in cursive, similar to the inscriptions found on colonial era portraits. Let's look at her transformations of the sketch. You'll notice how she has sharpened her line, moving from light descriptive strokes in the sketch that bring the figure into being, into bolder, more graphic contours. She also enlarges his figure and shifts the angle of the body up for a more monumental presentation. She draws attention to his eyes, large and at the viewer's level, their gaze now almost confrontational. To suggest Felipe as he was in life, she adds more torsion to the positioning of the body, also opening it up. The transformation seen here in the portrayal of Felipe will characterize the others, as we'll see. They include, number 1, the monumentalization of the pose, number 2, an emphasis on the eyes, and number 3, the use of a bolder, more graphic line in the finished portrait. I'm also interested in the materiality of the portraits and how their meaning resides in their making, to paraphrase Svetlana Alpers. The amate creates a warm skin tone for the figures, its variations at times helping suggest a sense of three-dimensionality or shading. Furthermore, her use of watercolor and natural ink on amate fosters transparency, suggesting ephemerality or impermanence, lending the final portraits a haunting quality. See the sheerness of the blue-green pigment laid over the background, the amate's color and texture bleeding through. Her visual strategies combined with the materials help create ghostly, spectral images. We witness Felipe's haunting figure coming into being, into focus, as it at times recedes into the warm brown ground. The portrait exists between time in both past and present. The second image portrays 16-year-old Carlos, called Goyito, who ventured to the US looking for work. In the final portrait, his piercing eyes, emphasized by defined eyebrows, connect with ours, suggesting the teen's self-awareness. The initial sketch seems reminiscent of a staged school or other official portrait. In the finished work, Rodriguez enlivened the sitter, turning his head and increasing the torsion of his pose, emphasizing in the process his friendliness. Notice how the natural color of the amate paper helps model Goyito's face, particularly on the left side. 16-year-old Juan follows. We notice again how Rodriguez emphasized the figure's large eyes, which make direct contact with us, framed by architectonic eyebrows. In moving from sketch to portrait, she downplays a hint of a smile in favor of a more serious formal tone. One seems more adult-like in the finished product, the nearly frontal position of body and face confronting the viewer directly. 10-year-old Darling, the first girl portrait, is placed in the center of the series. The darkest in tonality of all and the only portrait without a blue-green background, it serves as a visual anchor. We see Darlene's face in the final work through the vertical, wavy striations of the amate paper, as if a ghostly apparition underwater. The appealing tilt of her head, friendly smile, and large eyes draw us in. In contrast to the other portraits, Rodriguez's development from sketch to final version renders the graphic line of the sketch actually less defined in this case, more ethereal and haunting. And I hope you can see the vertical striations that are very pronounced in the final portrait. Next is 2-year-old Marie Juarez. Rodriguez captures the toddler's spontaneity, joy, and her sparkling eyes in an instant. Her open mouth reveals a single tooth. We can almost hear her giggle. The spontaneity of Rodriguez's line, especially evident in the toddler's hair and clothing on the left, gives us a sense of Marie's vivacious personality, also indicated by her tilted head. In contrast to the other portraits, Marie does not meet our gaze, though, instead looking down, which I think adds to the portrait's spontaneity. The reality effects are more pronounced in the sketch, with the final portrait again more graphic. One of the most poignant and evocative of the series is next, 7-year-old Jacqueline's portrait, and this one was created from a composite of 6 or 7 different photographs, according to Rodriguez. She looks down slightly on the viewer with large, dark, and dreamy eyes. Our inability to connect with her through the gaze makes this portrait evocative, melancholy, poignant. Jacqueline seems somewhat removed, even aloof. At the same time, the nearly frontal pose suggests a self-possessed girl. Examining the development from sketch to final painting, we notice that Rodriguez softened the worry in Jacqueline's eyes. They are now wistful and dreamy. The final in the series of 7 portrays 2-year-old Wilmer. Like Rodriguez's depiction of the toddler Marie, she employs here a freer pose, suggestive of a snapshot taken in an instant. His head tilted to the right, Rodriguez enhances the torsion of his body, suggesting the energy of a 2-year-old boy. Wearing a cap to keep his head warm, Wilmer looks up at us with large, dark brown eyes. His eyebrows emphasize their sadness, his downturned mouth echoing plaintiveness. In comparing Rodriguez's sketch to the final portrait, we notice how the artist reduced the angle of the body to make him more monumental, his pose more commanding, even confrontational. And this is heightened by our close-up view. By reviewing the transformation from sketches to final portraits, we noticed in all 7 portrayals that Rodriguez intentionally monumentalized the pose, focused her attention on the children's eyes, and used a bolder, more graphic line in the final versions. I now consider the portraits in 2 different contexts: visual practices of memorialization in Mexican American culture and visual rhetorics of sacred art. Then we will interpret the portraits in juxtaposition to theories of radical hospitality, trauma, and memory. In the end, I return to the questions raised in the beginning of this talk as we think about migration through Latinx art. Mexican Americans are heirs to a rich tradition of memorializing the deceased, practices both passed down from indigenous, African, and European ancestors, and newly transformed today. The observation of Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, is the most obvious example, but home altars, ofrendas, and roadside shrines also come to mind. It's helpful to think of Sandy's installation in this context. She is the 3rd generation of artists in her family, the daughter of a painter mother, and herself the creator of vibrant moving altares or Dia de los Muertos. In fact, last November, Rodriguez was the guest curator of Self-Help Graphics' virtual altar exhibition. so she's deeply familiar with visual traditions of memorializing the dead. She did not choose a traditional altar format, though, to commemorate the children, instead opting for something more enigmatic, perhaps even universal. And allow me to show you a more traditional altar honoring the Central American children. This also dates from last November, and it was created by the highly respected East Los Angeles altar artist Ofelia and Rosana Esparza in East LA. I'm not suggesting direct lines of influence here, but I'm more interested in how Rodriguez's portrayals are haunted by past images and practices. I use the term haunt in the manner suggested by Jacques Derrida in Spectres of Marx from 1993 and elaborated by other scholars. These past practices haunt, return to, persist in contemporary art. One of these practices is traditional funerary portraits of children, called Angelito Portraits or Little Angels, the name given to deceased children. The tradition was particularly vibrant in Mexico. These angelitos are commemorated in Mexico and in Mexican American communities on November 1st. So Dia de los Inocentes or Dia de los Angelitos. So part of the 2-day celebration of Days of the Dead, right? November 1st and 2nd. These photographic portraits, popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, are based on earlier colonial renditions done in oils, as discussed by art historian Elisa Mandel. Whereas the colonial examples were commissioned by and reserved for members of the elite, the democratic medium of photography brought this commemorative portrait type into the reach of even modest families who wished to record the passing of a loved one. Chicana artist Judith Hernandez created a stunning work in pastel inspired by this tradition in 2015, her Death of the Innocents. It was one of the standouts of the artist's 2018-19 solo show at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach. I think of it as an important precedent for Rodriguez's work. Hernandez created the work under similar circumstances. In response to the deaths of child migrants crossing the border into the US, as well as the generalized violence provoked by the cartels in Mexico. I've interpreted it as an echo of, or as haunted by, Mexican post-mortem photographs, as we see in this comparison. So we see similarities in the horizontal compositional arrangement, the peaceful pose of the body. Both figures are clad in white, also an allusion to innocence and purity. Red and green draperies wind around the figure in Hernandez's pastel, referencing the colors of the Mexican flag, and also recalling the winding or burial cloth of Christ. The deceased Inocente is thus held aloft, floating against a black background. Through these visual strategies, Hernandez suggests transcendence of earthly suffering, perhaps even apotheosis, an impression supported by the white light emanating from the figure's head and the upstretched wing. The title, Death of the Innocents, brings to mind a specific biblical reference, the Massacre of the Innocents, an event recounted in Matthew 2 of King Herod's slaughter of all male children 2 years of age and younger in Judea. Hernandez thereby suggests the sacredness of this lost life. Upon closer view, the beholder observes the names of deceased children and the year of their passing inscribed into the background. So I'm going to point to where you can see that. Sofia, Carlos, Juanita, Luis, Esther, Miguel, Raul. The names and dates pull the viewer back to earth to confront the humanity of suffering migrant children. Other explicitly sacred images seem to haunt Rodriguez's portraits here. Let's consider this Holy Face of Christ, this example by Spanish artist Francisco de Zurbarán from 1631. The painting fictively renders the relic of the Sudarium or the veil of Veronica housed at St. Peter's Basilica. During the Passion of Christ, as he carried the cross to Calvary, a woman offered to wipe Christ's face with her handkerchief. His visage was left miraculously imprinted on the cloth, a true image, or vera icona in Latin, on it, now venerated by the faithful. An image type first created in 15th century European art and especially popular in the 17th century Hispanic world, it offered artists the challenge of recreating the three-dimensional sudarium on a flat surface. So it's an exercise in trompe l'oeil or fool the eye painting. The image brings to mind various of Sandy Rodriguez's portrayals of the children, and You Will Not Be Forgotten, particularly the portrayal of Darling, positioned in the center. In both images, the nearly monochromatic rendering of the face on cloth or amate, respectively, suggests a shadowy apparition coming into being, a visitation from another world. Such blurriness was deployed by early modern artists to figure the visionary. And at the same time, I think Byzantine icons also come to mind. They're reminiscent of Rodriguez's emphasis on the children's large, dark, imploring eyes, especially in the images that are more frontal. Miraculous images also come to mind, especially those on indigenous textiles, such as the Virgin of Guadalupe. According to believers, this image appeared miraculously, divinely crafted on the tilma or cloak of native convert Juan Diego in the year 1531 in New Spain. Rodriguez's portraits and the widely venerated tilma of the Virgin of Guadalupe share material realities. Both appeared or purportedly appeared on indigenous textiles, Juan Diego's cloak of maguey fiber fabric, or the portraits on amate paper. While I'm not positing these sacred works as sources for Rodriguez's portraits in the traditional sense, I believe that her portraits produce meaning through their resonances with past sacred imagery. These visual echoes or representational hauntings operate like palimpsests, with prior meanings still present as ghostly echoes, a spectral presence in Rodriguez's portraits. Meanings from past sacred art still linger, analogous to how a word's etymology inflects its current meaning, the latter idea proposed by Heidegger in Being and Time. So I'm thinking about how Heidegger's theory of etymology can help us explicate how images produce meaning, their origins and past revolution resonating into the present. Rodriguez's portraits thus draw on a long tradition of memorializing the dead in Mexican and Mexican-American culture. Her portraits differ, though, from these precedents in that they portray the children as alive, an intentional choice, according to the artist. They resonate with strategies of commemoration or even veneration drawn from Hispanic and other sacred art. Instead of positing these past examples as direct sources, though, I suggest them as analogous images that form part of the context of the production of meaning. Others have focused on how Rodriguez draws on ancestral indigenous knowledge, referencing Maya and Aztec goddesses, invoking healing plants, even recreating ancient painting materials and techniques. Healing practices and painting's pigments are in fact connected, both in the indigenous and European worlds. Both depended historically on deep scientific and botanical knowledge. Building on the interpretation of her artistic technique as indigenous, I understand her practice as a manifestation of what has been called post-memory, as theorized by Marianne Hirsch. Post-memory describes the after effects of trauma as experienced by later generations. In our case, how the traumatic experiences of conquest and colonization are passed down. As Hirsch suggests, post-memory's connection to the past is, quote, not actually mediated by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation, end quote. Rodriguez's depictions of healing plants or specimens, such as we see here, the cure for susto or shock, which killed one of the migrant children, or the insect to cure heart pain, which killed another of the children. They act here as spells, as cures, as brujas incantations to heal. I've left till the end the consideration of portraiture in Chicanx and Central American art. It's not a well-studied topic. As an art born from the civil rights struggles of the 60s and 70s, portraiture was not a central concern of the Chicano movement in the way that muralism or posters were. Additionally, class issues complicated the status of portraiture. There were fewer Mexican-American patrons to commission portraits. Furthermore, many artists were engaged in the creation of types, attempting to make Mexican-American people visible, not surprising given the minoritized position and underrepresentation of Mexican-Americans in fine arts, the media, and the public eye. The just published exhibition catalog for the Smithsonian show, Printing the Revolution, presents new scholarship on the topic, on what the show's curator, E. Carmen Ramos, described as ideological portraiture, and this is a term taken from Lucy Lepard. Ramos analyzes the unusual trajectory of portraiture in Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx art. A genre normally commissioned by wealthy elites, Chicanx artists revamped portraiture to recognize important historical figures and activists, and we see that on the catalog's cover. They moved portraiture from the palace or mansion to the streets in the form of posters carried in protests. By portraying civil rights icons or other important historical figures, Chicanx artists corrected the biased telling of history from which POC were often excluded, as Ramos points out. These include print portraits of people killed by the police. In 1975, Chicano artist Amado Empeña Jr. created this work, Aquellos que han muerto, to commemorate a 12-year-old killed by Dallas, Texas police in 1973. More recently, the artist Ore Original, working in Oakland, California, began the portrait series Justice for Our Lives in support of Black Lives Matter to memorialize people killed by the police. Created from photographs he receives from victims' families, Ore creates digital prints made freely available online, and Ramos discusses this. Similarly, the artist Jesus Barraza, also working in the Bay Area, creates limited edition screen prints and digital prints that can be downloaded, printed, and used at protests. As Claudia Zapata points out in her essay, Chicanx Graphics in the Digital Age, Barraza's portraits reclaim and correct, quote, negative media stories that often unsympathetically portray the victim as either threat or promote a justification for their killing, end quote. Such portraits carried in the streets become part of the public ritual of commemoration and mourning, but also serve as correctives to the biased mainstream news, as Zapata reminds us. Rodriguez's portraits in You Will Not Be Forgotten remind me of these portraits, designed like hers to memorialize innocent children. Indeed, although their medium is different, natural ink and pigments on handcrafted amate paper, Rodriguez's portraits and these poster portraits share similarities in their visual language. Notice the graphic use of line to delineate facial features, the emphasis on face and eyes, and the monumentalization of the sitter, all articulating the desire to not forget. I would like to end today's paper by returning to the concept of radical hospitality with which I began today. The concept comes from Derrida, based on a seminar convened in Paris in 1996 and published as a dialogue between Derrida and Anne Dufour-Montel. The dialogue opposes the notion that hospitality should be conditional, but instead unconditional, even hyperbolic. Derrida and his interlocutor tease out the tensions inherent to this utopian concept of unconditional hospitality. They acknowledge that it exceeds civic discourse and political space as they currently exist. In the face of calls for unconditional hospitality, citizens respond. What about our need to protect home, property, community? The response in 1993 of France's former Prime Minister, Michel Rocard, that, quote, France could not receive all the misery of the world, end quote, parallels responses in the US. As a result, governments struggle to establish limits on hospitality in order to make it effective or to put it realistically into practice. Such compromises lead to restrictions and conditions that transform hospitality into a contract, a policed pact, in Derrida's words, one involving rights, duties, borders, passports, doors, and immigration laws, all designed to limit and control. In response to these real-world concerns, Derrida calls for a pure and hyperbolic hospitality to create the best possible conditions, the most just legislation, the least bad situation. Quote, this is the double law of hospitality, to calculate the risks, yes, but without closing the door on the incalculable, that is, on the future and the foreigner, he offers. This approach constitutes the unstable site of strategy and decision, a site being searched for today, for example, in debates on immigration. So the quest for the best conditions of hospitality, the process of perfecting this, constitutes progress. What is the role of art and artists in this current context in the face of such human suffering? As we've seen today, artists play a special role in this process, particularly in mediating the tensions inherent to pure hospitality or hospitality as hyperbole. To welcome the other, to paraphrase Derrida, we must know the other's name and the other's identity. At the same time, though, we have to prevent this knowing from becoming an interrogation, a blacklist, the border patrol. This is particularly poignant because the immigrant, the refugee, the foreigner must ask for hospitality in a foreign language, in a language that is not their own, described by Derrida as the first violence that an immigrant experiences. We've seen today in the work of Sandy Rodriguez and others that artists can humanize this process of knowing by making the immigrant, refugee, or perceived foreigner known at the unstable site of strategy and decision. Portraiture, in fact, by its very definition, has particular power in this context due to its ability to humanize the other. We are predisposed, in fact, when beholding portraiture to do just this. Additionally, the references in Rodriguez's work to the past, in her materials, her technique, the inclusion of ancient Mesoamerican indigenous imagery, reveal the particular power of art to bring past and present together, to illuminate how the past conditions the present, how the history of conquest and colonization, dating back to 1492, haunts us today. Thus, her work is both retrospective and prospective, to borrow terminology from Amir Ashel in his discussion of Holocaust memorials. She offers viewers the ability or choice to make these connections on their own. This element of choice in considering the past has the potential to create for Eshel what he calls futurity. What future will we choose? Rodriguez's 7 portraits, while depicting individual children, also points to the structural and historical conditions that caused these tragedies. Rodriguez's artwork is clear, though, in encoding hope for the future, as it is informed by the past. Hope in indigenous decolonizing practices, be they botanical, artistic, or cultural. Hope in sacralizing migrant children, and hope that by making detention and deportation visible, we will be moved to offer radical hospitality. It is, in other words, art's potential for hyperbole that offers hope. Its ability to portray children as saints, as gods, as cured by natural remedies and healers, and as embodiments of centuries of indigenous wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlene. Thank you so much for an extremely thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
We have two questions from our participants. I'd like to offer the first one. Are there particular differences in form or content that you would point to in comparing recent Chicanx, Latinx visual art about migration and earlier generations, I think, about migration? Very interesting question.
Okay, that's a great question. It speaks to a whole part of the paper I had to cut out. So maybe that'll become another paper where, as you know, that migration is not a serious concern early in the Chicano movement because Chicanos are busy asserting that the border crossed us, right? That Chicanos, we were always here, this is our land. So, I mean, there are a few, I can think of like 1972, Rupert Garcia, I can think of a few exceptions to that. But it's really in the 90s when things begin to shift and you see more and more artists addressing migration. And the work that I've done, I trace this to what's happening in California, all this anti-immigrant legislation that's happening, Prop 187, et cetera, in California in the 90s. So you see all of a sudden a turning point in Chicanx artistic production. And then I would say since 2015, there's been just an avalanche of artworks looking at this theme. There's a lot of amazing, I have 2 graduate students in my seminar last quarter working on performance and conceptual art addressing migration. So there's a lot of exciting artwork going on right now. Thank you for a wonderful question.
Nothing appeared like this. So just following up, nothing appeared like this in the 1930s and the 1950s during periods of substantial repatriation and deportation. Is that right? And if that's right, why?
Okay, that's a great question. It's reminding me of a recent essay we published in Latin American and Latinx visual culture by Ed McCann on depictions of immigration and or depictions of the border, the US-Mexican border. And I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Why not? Why does this? I mean, it certainly emerges in the 90s, I think, in response to just a series of attempts to criminalize immigration in California, this huge upsurge in anti-immigrant sentiment. That's the best answer I have at the moment off the top of my head.
Sure. Second question from one of our participants who begins by saying, thank you very much for your well-researched and presented paper. Do you think that the way in which Sandy Rodriguez's portraits are displayed within the gallery is different from the way posters have been used in public commemoration and mourning by other Latinx artists?
Thank you. That's a really thought-provoking question. I thought a lot about posters out on the streets or on altares memorializing people. And I thought about the context of the fine art gallery. And this is a fine art gallery for sure. And I thought a lot about the similarities and differences between these impulses to memorialize. One of the things that's interesting to me about Rodriguez's installation is it was in 2 different rooms, and it can be hung in a variety of different ways, right? It's separate works that are hung together. And I ended the paper with that discussion of people thinking about the past and choosing how they're going to act in the future. And there is this element of choice in how one engages with those portraits in the gallery itself. And when you come in, when you enter the gallery, they were there on the left wall and they're very prominent, but one could make a different choice and look at the landscapes or the more indigenous images or the botanicals. So I think there's something about that empowering choice in the installation that feeds into this idea of futurity, that urges us to make a choice in the face of migration.
Thank you. Third question. From one of our seminar participants, our symposium participants, Tatiana Reynosa asks, how do Rodriguez's portraits also anticipate climate migration, which will be one of the biggest challenges of this century?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. There are, I just showed you briefly, there are two just stunning large portraits. One of them, definitely one of them from the border in Arizona, in southern Arizona, it looked very familiar to me. And in these desert landscapes. So I think the issue, she's in the field right now, by the way. Sandy's actually in the borderlands doing work, gathering pigments, doing field work right now. And I mean, the climate change is changing things so that there is more migration into the United States and really globally around the world. But I think it is her deep engagement with plants and plant life as sacred objects, as tools for healing, I think speaks to that environmental emphasis in her work, and that's coming out in other artists' work right now. Thank you.
Sure. A very interesting question. I wonder if there are any Central American artists who have done similar work representing the death of the Central American children that you could point out for us.
I don't know, and if somebody knows, I'd like to hear about that. I'm not aware of anyone, of a Central American artist who specifically addressed this, but I wouldn't be the person who would know that necessarily. I looked around and didn't see anything. What's interesting to me is, you know, I did think about this, like it's a Chicana artist portraying the death of Central American children. I thought a lot about her kind of hemispheric approach to indigeneity, her hemispheric consideration of the politics in the Americas. But if somebody drop in the chat, please, if somebody knows the answer to that.
In viewing these images, I was reminded of Our Lady of Fatima and the young children who were involved in the experience in 1917. Though young, those children were instrumental in bringing hope to a world at war.
Mm-hmm.
These images represent hope, for me, a hope for the future. Could this be another reason why these images represent the livingness of these young ones?
Oh, that's a wonderful observation. Thank you so much. I didn't think of, I was so interested in the Virgin Guadalupe and the maguey fabric and the tilma and the maguey or the amate, but that is a wonderful, wonderful connection to make. And I'll have to think about that some more, but yeah, and they absolutely represent hope for me. Thank you so much.
Another attendee asks a straightforward question. Can a conversation about migration avoid centering undocumented narratives?
So I have another question. Why would we do that? Or why would we want to do that? Or my initial response to that would be, I mean, my mind goes there to undocumented migrants because of their incredible precarity and vulnerability at this moment. And more so perhaps than other migrants. Yeah, that would be, my question would be, what would we get by partitioning that aside, like moving undocumented migration to the side? What would we get from that? And I think for me, I'm driven by the artwork, first of all, and I see undocumented migration as a real concern in the artworks.
How, another participant asks, and I'm going to rephrase it just slightly, does art bring about empathy?
Oh, okay, that's a wonderful question. I deeply believe that art has the ability to foster empathy. Visual art literature, music. I think that is one of the most powerful, art is one of the most powerful tools for building empathy. And I think it is absolutely central to what Rodriguez is doing here, is trying to get us to empathize with the circumstances of these particular children. Yeah, that's a wonderful question.
We have just one more question, I believe, maybe two. The artist's placement of the birds and the large penmanship used for their names draws the eye to the bottom of the pictorial space in a way that, according to the questioner, to me, competes with a presumed focus on the children's faces. What do you make of this?
Okay, that's interesting. I read the script. The script is very consciously cursive. It's this big cursive that looks reminiscent to me of older colonial portraits. I showed that. That's, to me, one of the most convincing comparisons there. I did puzzle about the placements of the birds, and I looked and looked. I didn't have a chance to ask her. She's not available, right? She'll be back in April. But thinking about why the birds are there, I mean, they almost felt like insignia to me in a funny way. And in the self, I don't know if you noticed in the self-portrait, Sandy, she's in profile, but there's this insect, and it's also down at the bottom. So I would like to ask her, that's interesting that you felt that it drew attention to the bottom of the portraits. I just saw such an insistent, the eyes are so insistent. And when I looked at all the portraits in a line, the way she makes the eyes so much bigger and larger and very dark, these insistent eyes, they're at our level. That's what's so powerful, right? Because they can be looking, the gaze can be down, it can be evasive, it can be looking up, it can be all kinds of things, but it's right at us. And I felt that it was verging on confrontational. I'll have to think about your question and ask her what she intended.
Okay. Then perhaps, well, oh gosh, our questions keep coming. We've got a little more time. We'll take another 5 minutes or so. Given that reciprocity is so important to Indigenous thought, one of our attendees asks, what was behind your decision to foreground Derrida's concept of hospitality?
So that's a good question. I thought about this. I thought I intentionally was not citing like Chicanx theory, and I could have. And it's because of my commitment to bringing discussion of Chicanx culture to bear on what I think of as mainstream culture in the university, mainstream academic culture. I don't like this feeling like we're partitioned off over here in ethnic studies and we have nothing to say about hospitality. We have plenty to say. We're like the epicenter of these discussions around migration. You know, why should the French and Derrida get all the credit? So it's a very intentional move on my part to demonstrate the importance of Chicanx visual art. That's interesting. I could definitely deepen the discussion of Indigenous influences here, I think. I was a little nervous because I feel like other people have done that already. In the article that I cite by Nandi Conaponte and Eladias, that really focuses on indigeneity in a way that I don't feel that I quite can. And, I was initially trained as a Western art historian, but you're making me rethink that. And you're absolutely right that reciprocity could be a powerful frame for deepening our understanding here.
And our last question, we've gone through just about all of the questions, is from me personally. So there's a way of understanding much of what you discussed as a critique of American immigration policy, at least the policy implications of this. As I'm a political scientist, not an art historian, so I'm going to focus on the public policy. Is there art, have you come across art that similarly critiques the role of Central American governments and of the Mexican government in contributing to the type of suffering that migrants and especially migrant children ultimately experience, or perhaps have experienced at the southern border or in their own countries, that
Mhm.
helps us understand then why these children are trying to come over and their families are trying to come over to the United States.
Well, the major authority on contemporary Central American art is Kenzie Cornejo, and who's did her PhD at Duke, and she's at the University of New Mexico. She has a book coming out that's so powerful that talks about how contemporary artists are critiquing politics in Central America, and that I can't wait to see that final book. So I think it's pretty close to coming out. So for I would say in Mexico, which I know a little bit better, there definitely are artists critiquing. I'm thinking back to the 70s, Los Grupos in the 70s, artists in the 90s post NAFTA, all this rich conceptual art, performance art, installation art that's definitely critiquing what's going on, so the circumstances in Mexico, and all of this amazing art on the border also in the Tijuana area or Juarez area that's also very critical. So yes, that's another part of the story, right? That's the background. And and it might be interesting to look at those influences perhaps that are going back and forth there. Mhm.
Um,
Thank you.
sure. Professor Charlene Villaseñor Black, thank you so very much. One, for a magnificent lecture,
Mhm.
extremely thought-provoking again. And thanks as well for being our visiting scholar
Mm,
in our Young Scholar Symposium
mhm,
held here at the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where
mhm,
we've had one day already of
mhm.
absolutely fascinating presentations and discussions from younger scholars doing work in the area of Latinx art, broadly defined. And they'll have another day of a seminar with you tomorrow. So thank you so much for leading us in
Mhm.
this consideration, exploration, and ultimately understanding of
Mhm.
how art, in fact, is such a magnificent way of understanding our contemporary reality and the historical roots of
Mm.
that contemporary reality.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be discussing the work of these younger scholars, to be able to present to you all. I appreciate your generosity and the questions. This is a brand new project. I've never given this paper before, so it's fresh off the keyboard. And these kinds of presentations are important to get feedback, to get suggestions, to see which arguments are convincing and which aren't. So I'm very grateful. It's also really helped me to be here. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you. If everyone can join me virtually in clapping and thanking Dr. Charlene Villaseñor Black for her lecture and presentation. And thank you to the 37 folks who are still on. At one point, we had 46 who are still on listening to the talk. We very much appreciate your participation. Have a good evening, everyone.